Welcome. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. Tonight's program is very dear to my heart. I went to Russia as a freelancer in the summer of 1990 and worked up to Moscow bureau chief for Businessweek magazine. I left in the middle of 1999, not long before Putin became prime minister and then president. Beth Noble, the other moderator tonight, and I crossed paths during that time, the tumultuous but exciting Yeltsin era. We won't tell you stories about that. And who replaced me at Businessweek when I left? One of our authors tonight, Paul Starobin. I will talk to Paul later in the program about his new book, Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia. We are splitting tonight's program into two segments. First, Beth will talk for 20 minutes with Alan Phillips, a former Moscow correspondent for Reuters and the Daily Telegraph, who wrote The Red Hotel, Moscow 1941, the Metropole Hotel, and the Untold Story of Stalin's Propaganda War. Beth is a former Moscow bureau chief for CBS News, who now teaches journalism at Fordham University. She's also a governor on the OPC board. After they talk, Paul and I will talk for the next 20 minutes, and then we will take questions about both books. Please put your questions in the chat. The program is being recorded and later will be posted on YouTube. Now I turn it over to Beth and Alan.
Thank you so much, Patty. It's thank you all for being here at this time of great upheaval in Russia again. Here's the book. Oh, there it is, The Red Hotel.
Fantastic.
There we go. We got to get your name there, Alan.
Yep.
So before we start, can you just tell everybody a little bit about your career in Moscow, about your career more generally, and what it was that brought you to write this book?
Well, first, it's a great honor to speak to an organization which is founded to promote press freedom and to talk about propaganda and disinformation. Well, my career started in 1979 when I was the Reuters trainee in Moscow. They always had a trainee there to man the desk, the news agency desk in the evening, and watch the evening news and see if any of the newsreaders was wearing a black tie. If they're wearing a black tie, it meant that Brezhnev might be dead, or on any one of the old crocs. So if that was the case, you had to tell the bureau chief and sort of try and find out what was happening. So I did that for a year and ended up with the Moscow Olympics, if anyone can remember that. I was next in Moscow at the beginning of the Gorbachev era, 1985, but I got caught up in what was called the Gordievsky affair. Margaret Thatcher expelled more than 20 Soviet spies from London, so the Russians retaliated, and I was one of the ones who had to go. Anyway, before I went to Moscow, I had been posted by Reuters to Tunis, not the world's most important news place, to cover North Africa, and the press corps was about 3 people. The most interesting of the 3 people was a woman called Tanya Matthews. She'd been born Tanya Svetlova in Grozny. At that time, when she was born, the center of the oil industry. Anyway, there wasn't much news to cover, but we used to have long lunches at her lovely place in Tunis, a seaside village, all blue and white, Sidi Bou Said. And she explained that she'd managed to escape the Soviet Union by becoming an interpreter, a sort of what was called a secretary translator for one of the British journalists who came out to Russia in 1941 to cover the Eastern Front. They didn't do much covering of the Eastern Front at the time because they weren't allowed anywhere near it. But anyway, some of the correspondents got pretty close to their translators. Anyway, so she married a correspondent called Matthews. Anyway, so she told me, and then she ended up in Tunis actually as the BBC correspondent. So she graduated from translator to correspondent. She told me all about what went on in the Metropole, and I thought, this is a fascinating story, but why has no one ever written it? Anyway, I went back to Moscow in '85, not for very much long, what 4 or 5 months, and I wasn't allowed back as a permanent correspondent until '94 to '98. I was there. Anyway, it took even longer than that to get to grips with the story. I was actually at the Metropole Hotel, which you, of course, know very well, and some other people listening may know it, for a charity ball, of all things. Such things existed then. And a friend gave me a newly published book, A History of the Metropole, and I looked for the wartime chapter, and there I found some useful leads, not just Tanya, particularly an extraordinary woman called Nadia Ulanovskaya, who was born in what is now Ukraine, a rather benighted shtetl, and seized with both hands the liberation which came with the Bolshevik Revolution. And she fought with the Bolsheviks in a civil war, and then went abroad for military intelligence, spying in Hamburg, Shanghai, and 2 years in New York. Anyway, so I found her story, and when I finally left Chatham House, where I'd been working, I had enough to build on what I knew from Tanya in person, and from Nadia's memoirs, and some recollections, diaries, and things of the British and American reporters to build it up.
Yeah, in fact, Alan, there had been things written about this, but they were written as individual memoirs.
Individual memoirs, yes.
Yeah, so can you talk about the research process more generally?
Well, the key person was Nadia Ulanovskaya, with her good English from having spent 2 years in New York. She was basically appointed as the chief translator to keep an eye on the others. It was a strange time in the fact that there was complete fraternization was allowed in the Metropole between the foreigners and the Soviet citizens, which wasn't allowed anywhere else in Stalin's time. That was to keep the journalists quiet, since they weren't really allowed to do their job. Anyway, she never wrote anything. She'd spent quite a long time in the Gulag, which we could get onto later. But her daughter did sit her down and put a tape recorder in front of her. So there was a slightly incoherent memories in Russian, which could be put together to make a story very successfully. As for going to Russia, there weren't any archives I could find. I could go there. There would be many more secrets in the KGB archives. I'd love to know what was written about this time, of course, but I don't imagine that's going to happen for years to come. So, but there was quite a lot of information in the British archives, the National Archives, not from MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service, but from the Domestic Security Service, because they were keeping a very close eye on the correspondent for the Times, the London Times, and the New York Times, who was called Ralph Parker. And he also wrote for the New York Times as well, because he liked to dabble a bit in spying for both sides, and no one trusted him. Anyway, so there was useful information there. There were the descendants of people who worked there, all very keen, sorry, not all, some of them very keen, some of them not so keen, to talk about what had gone on there. So, yeah, there weren't any useful archives I could look at in Russia. And someone who I really wanted to talk to who might have talked to me 10 years before, because he actually got hold of one of my colleagues at the Times to talk about this time. He decided that it wasn't in his interest to participate in a book which might be seen as Russophobic or whatever. So that's the guidelines.
How frustrating. But you did speak with some of the relatives of the primary movers in the book.
Yes. When you're doing this kind of research, you always need a bit of luck. And to find out more about Ralph Parker, who was a mysterious person who no one really trusted, he wasn't content to be a journalist. He liked to do a little bit of spying, or at least sort of exchanging intelligence, to make himself feel big. Anyway, his first wife was Czech, and I wanted to find out more from the Czech side. I had no contacts in the Czech Republic. So what we all do, I went to Google and I asked Google for a list of Czech historians at British universities, and it came up with about a dozen. And I looked at these, and one of them was at Warwick, where my son had been. I thought, well, I'll try her. So he said, oh, well, I'm sorry to disturb you. Can you point me to someone who could do some research for me, blah, blah, blah. And she said, oh, no, you don't need to do that. I know the Hofbauer family of old. I grew up next door to them. I will introduce you to all of them. So that was a bit of luck, for example. So they were very keen to talk. In fact, the woman I really wanted to speak to, by the time I got there, she was actually unfortunately on her deathbed, but she was so organized that she got her niece to come from Hungary with pictures, letters, and stories. So they were very keen to help, for example.
Wow.
On the other side, in one book, there's you might call, I suppose he's the baddie of the journalists. He's a very ambitious Australian. I don't know if there are any Australian journalists listening here, Australian, who played the system very well. When he was in Moscow, he sort of kept his nose clean and filed a lot of stuff, pretty propagandistic. But all the time, he was getting all the information he could get, writing it in a tiny hand in little notebooks from Nadia, his interpreter, and he found out everything about what had happened in the 30s, the reality of life in the Soviet Union. None of this went into what he reported for any newspaper. It wouldn't get past the censor anyway. And he even persuaded her to take him to visit a Soviet family in their homes. Now, this very simple journalistic exercise, which you'd give to a sort of trainee on day one, was completely banned. You were not allowed to see how they lived, the cramped living conditions, basically. And Nadia said to him, if you publish this, it could be bad for me. And he said, don't worry, Nadia, it'll be a novel. Well, he did write a novel, but he barely disguised Nadia. In fact, even used her name for one of the characters. So it didn't take the KGB of the time a long time to find her. And she ended up in the Gulag, not actually far from where Navalny has been, in Vorkuta, inside the Arctic Circle. Yes, who didn't want to talk? So his daughter was very suspicious of me. And I did actually go and see her because of my Reuters training. You have to get both sides of the story. Anyway, she did open the door to me. We had agreed. She didn't offer me a glass of water or even a cup of coffee, but basically she said, if you tell anything to a journalist, whatever it is, you must expect it to appear in print sooner or later. I think that doesn't really apply to people who help you in dictatorial regimes. In fact, I don't think it applies at all in dictatorial regimes. Anyway, that was their story.
So speaking of dictatorial regimes, let's talk a little bit about what life was like for the correspondents who were in Russia, in the pre-war period and in World War II. I mean, much of the book is about their plight. For those who haven't read the book yet, tell them, please, what did these correspondents have to go through?
Well, um, uh, people who follow Russia in the 1930s will know the name of Walter Duranty, who got his Pulitzer Prize for his writing. He was a very fluent writer, a Brit actually from Liverpool, but he always knew what Stalin wanted to read, and to a certain extent what Roosevelt wanted to read too. And he triangulated between these and pleased them, and of course denied the Ukrainian famine, said it was all got up by the British. It was sort of typical British anti-communist thing. Anyway, but it got harder and harder towards the end of the 30s because Stalin had had enough of foreign reporters, and by 1940, of course, Russia hadn't joined the war then. By 1940, his successor had decided that it wasn't worth staying. His successor was another Brit called Eric Geddy, and he cabled to New York that there is no news value in being Moscow at all, and anyone who works there basically knows that they're wasting their time. He cabled that to New York, and then he closed down the bureau. Of course, that seemed the right thing to do, but within a year, of course, Stalin and Roosevelt were going to be allies, so I don't think he was ever forgiven for that. So in 1941, because of the lack of journalists, Russia was still a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside a riddle, or the other way around. So there was a huge appetite in the States, in Britain, public appetite to know what made Russia tick. Was Stalin a good guy, a bad guy? Was he a blood-soaked dictator? Was he going to save Europe? All that kind of thing. So some of the best war correspondents in Britain, of course, there was nowhere left on the European continent that hadn't been swallowed up by the Nazi war machine. So they fought each other to get there. The Russians limited the numbers. They wanted, thought 24 was about the limit that they could cope with at the time. And as they made their way there, they began to realize quite quickly that it was not going to be a tea party. They were told in no uncertain terms by God, what's his name? Stalin's favorite. Ehrenberg, Ilya Ehrenberg. I've forgotten his quote. They were told by Ilya Ehrenberg, who was Stalin's favorite war correspondent, that they should forget their Western ethics when they came to Moscow. And he said, all objective correspondents in a wartime should be shot. Obviously, they weren't going to be shot because they were allies, but it was made clear that they were going to be part of the Kremlin propaganda output, whether they liked it or not.
So they can't, it's like they're living basically in a giant Potemkin village where they're barely allowed out. When they are allowed out, everything is choreographed around them. And then their copy has to go through censors.
Yeah, and the censors, sometimes they even rewrote the stuff so it would fit in with the Kremlin line. And any attempt to add some color to some copy would be excised. For example, one reporter spoke to a Soviet soldier and said, well, how's it going? And the soldier said, Hitler kaput. And he put that in his copy, but the censor said, oh, no, you can't write that. He said, why not? Well, we understand that Hitler's still alive. So it was extremely rigorous, but also mindless, the censorship. They couldn't travel outside Moscow. I mean, they could go to the Bolshoi every night of the week if they wanted to. They could go to the theaters. if they could afford it, they could go to a restaurant. But they had very generous rations, even as much vodka and caviar as they wanted, while the rest of Russia was practically on starvation rations. Um, so they lived relatively well. They were mostly extremely grumpy, drank too much, and I suppose thought, well, one day we will get to Berlin. We will be first to the ruins of Berlin. After Stalingrad, when the fighting had stopped, they tore the place. There was some good copy there, but they had to wait a very long time for anything, and they were always escorted.
So before we turn it over to Paul and Patty, I also want to make sure we get to the unsung heroes of this book, which are the secretary translators. And those
Yes.
of us who, arrived in Moscow, maybe not speaking very good Russian, know that feeling of being dependent on, usually a wonderful person with great journalistic instincts. Who were these translators, and what happened to them? What pressures were they under?
Uh, well, they had to report to a KGB minder. Actually, the organization was called the NKVD at the time. Every week, they had to say what the reporter was talking about, what type of person they are, if they'd met anyone, had they been anywhere, had they said anything interesting. So they did that. I mean, some of them said, I have said, even said it to the reporters that this was the drill. But where did they come from? There weren't a huge number of people fluent in English. Obviously, Nadia, who had been to New York, was there. But Tanya, my friend in Tunis, she was not as loyal to Stalin as she might have appeared. But because she spoke good English, learned from American oil men from Tennessee, I think, in Grozny. She was hired. Probably, if the KGB had been looked more closely, they would realize that she was a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Sovieteer and just wanted to get out, which she did. There was another interesting one who told everyone in the Metropole that she had been sentenced to the Gulag in Kazakhstan for a number of years, but she wrote, she'd had a letter writing campaign, and she'd had her sentence reduced. But actually the truth, and I found this out from Memorial, is that it wasn't as a result of her letter writing campaign that she was released early. She had to spend 2 years in the Lubyanka, in the prison, as a stool pigeon with other women, foreigners, because she was a good speaker. And as a result of that, she was allowed out early. So, but that wasn't known to, she was a very jolly person, and no one realized that that's how she got out of jail early. So well, you know what it's like, what was like in the Soviet Union or after the Soviet Union, when Soviet citizens were dealing with foreigners. They liked to not have any other Soviet citizens with them, so that things couldn't be reported back to them, basically. So usually, and if someone was more confident, then that was a bit suspicious. That would suggest that they were well in with the secret police. And indeed, Ralph Parker, the Times man, who I keep referring to, his translator, whom he married, was generally assumed to be a colonel in the KGB. I don't think she was, but she was very effective anyway.
Thanks so much, Alan. We'll be back. And here's the Red Hotel, and we will pass it over to Paul and Patty. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alan and Beth. So I have a few questions for Alan, but I'll save them till the Q&A. So Paul, tell us a little bit about how you got the idea for Putin's Exiles and how you did the reporting.
Right. So initially, my thought about this book, and this was before the all-out invasion of Ukraine by Putin 2 years ago, was to go inside of Russia and maybe go to some places that journalists and people don't usually go to, and just try to maybe undermine or at least question some of the things that everyone thinks they know about Russia, to kind of approach it from that perspective. But the foreign ministry did not cooperate with my project, so they never actually approved my visa. I began to think, and now the war has happened. So what can I do with this? And so if I can't talk to Russians inside of Russia, why don't I talk to them outside of Russia? Because about 1 million of them had fled after the war. And it seemed to me very interesting that a kind of age-old Russian pattern was repeating itself of exile, which has always been sort of the flip side of repression. So you can go back to the 19th century, even earlier, and there have always been these exiles, many of whom have been politically charged and organized with an agenda for change inside of Russia, but, you know, brought about from outside of Russia. That whole dynamic struck me as interesting. So that was the genesis of the project.
And what countries did you go to primarily to do your reporting?
So I did the field research in Armenia and Georgia. In Armenia, I was in Yerevan, the capital of that country, and in Georgia, I was in both Tbilisi mainly, but also I went to Batumi, which is in the westernmost part on the shores of the Black Sea. I also did quite a bit of interviewing on Zoom, with exiles from all over the place, Munich and Paris, London, Washington, D.C., Cyprus. I mean, they are truly this kind of global diaspora. So not being able to go everywhere, on foot, I did quite a bit of that as well.
Hmm. Well, uh, your chapters and your book, you describe several categories of the exiles, and some of them were Navalny followers, some were
Hmm.
dissident priests, some were military types, and some, as we know, were journalists. So, could you start with the journalists? Um, how are they conducting what you call the information resistance, and is their coverage having any impact inside Russia?
Right. So in Putin's Russia, and remember he's been in power now for about 25 years, it just became increasingly difficult for anyone to do truly independent journalism. Not impossible, but particularly once the war started, it literally became a crime just to call it a war. It had to be called a special military operation. So the situation was really just untenable. In my chapter on the information resistance, I focused on a independent TV station, TV Rain, Dost, which began during the Putin years, not explicitly against Putin, but as attempting to be this independent voice of news and commentary. So they left pretty much just after the war. It just became untenable. They played a few bars of Swan Lake, which has memories because that's what's sort of played whenever there's this interregnum or something big happening in Russia, and the authorities don't want anybody to be, to think about it. So that was a little bit of an ironic homage. Many of them went to Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, where they established their headquarters. Others went to Tbilisi. So what happened was they ran into a lot of problems. I mean, they regarded themselves as sort of umbilically attached to Russia, and their mission was to undertake, news and commentary investigations, and in the Russian language, deliver that media back into Russia, into the Russian homeland, where platforms like YouTube and Telegram, were still open. So this was a feasible thing. The Latvians, I mean, some of the challenges here illustrated in this, the Latvians did not like that the TV Rain people would refer to the Russians and the Russian army even as a we. They objected to that. They thought it should be a they. So there are all these conflicts, and ultimately their license was revoked in Riga, and they had to relocate to Amsterdam, from which they are now operating. I think they're an important voice. I think there are others like Medusa, which is still based in Riga, that are important voices. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, it has to be in the Russian language. I mean, that's, you're going back into Russia, you're trying to influence hearts and minds. One of the journalists for TV Rain in Tbilisi, whom I met with, told me that, I think we've lost my grandfather, but maybe we can save my grandmother. You know, uh, so many people, as you know, Patty, particularly brought up, in the Soviet time, are just habitual. The state media, state-controlled media is kind of what they know, and not just even for news, entertainment, all kinds of things. So they're sort of hooked on it. And TV Rain is, it's something different. It tried to appeal to a younger audience, a little more hip. So it's a real challenge, but they get millions of views. I mean, there is a lot of media that is flowing into Russia, also just at the level of bloggers and people like that. So Navalny's funeral, for example, which is coming up tomorrow in Moscow, March 1st, there's a tremendous amount of information from the Russian exiled media about what's happening. Hello to your dog.
Sorry.
It's
So,
okay.
Paul, I was surprised when I read your book, even though I think I knew it subliminally. Why don't the Russians block YouTube?
Right. And we don't know exactly why. The best answer I've had to that, because I know that there are, these Russian exiled journalists are preparing for the day that they block YouTube, because they have various strategies that they're going to put into effect if that happens. But YouTube is just used by so many ordinary Russians for, like, their kids watching cartoons, or their, the parents at night watching, movies and songs, all kinds of things. And the political part of it is just one small fraction. So I think that the authorities are still kind of calibrating just how much do they want to crack down. I mean, you can get people kind of restive and unhappy if you start denying them simple things like being able to access YouTube. So it's, I think it's that kind of a calculation. They may also realize that even if they crack down on YouTube, there are other ways. I mean, these exiles, and many of them are also skilled in technology. It's estimated that something like 10% of the IT workers, largely based in Moscow and St. Petersburg, went into exile after the war. So many of Russia's most talented and creative people are now in exile, and they're not so easily thwarted by Kremlin efforts to block channels of information.
I find that very interesting. um, so, moving on, you already talked a little bit about the generational divide, and many of your characters, you describe them having conflicts with their parents.
Yes.
I think most of us can just understand that without any explanation. So, can you move on and tell us how has the killing of Navalny affected those who resist Russia inside and outside of Russia?
Well, I think it's still very early days, but what we're seeing is that some people are feeling demoralized, like, they killed off our guy, the single most charismatic and influential figure, revered by those who really, supported him. He was more than just a political figure. He became a figure of reverence and even kind of a living martyr. But what I'm also picking up is quite a bit of anger, and among people who are really committed to a Putin opposition, I think there's going to be a greater degree of militancy that develops, and I've been talking to people about that. So I expect we'll see things like more targeted assassinations of people in Russia who in some way are associated with the government, whether it's promoting the war or just any number of things. I think that some of that has taken place already, and I think we'll see more of it. There are also some people who have taken up the gun in Ukraine. There's a Free Russia Legion that has been organized, and it's difficult to say exactly how many people it has, but I've been talking to those people as well, including, for example, a volunteer who's on the front lines. And they say, well, yeah, of course, you can't just lay flowers on graves. There's not going to be any change in Russia unless we force the issue. Now, we don't know how far those people will get, but I think that there will be more people who feel that way and attempt to, act on those, on that agenda and those impulses. And it's an old story in Russia. I mean, I was reading today about the 19th century. They killed the Tsar in 1881, this group called Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will. They were insurgents. It's just the flip. The more repression that you get in Russia and the more murder that appears to be state directed, I think the more reaction you'll get.
Well, Russians created the anarchist movement, so
Yeah, Kropotkin and Bakunin.
One thing that I really wondered, and that scared me, frankly, is stories of a week or so ago about how Putin went after some of the exiled Russians, or one of the rock groups. I think it was
Yeah,
in Turkey. I forget which country, but how
Indonesia and
how do
Thailand,
you?
actually. Yeah.
Oh, Thailand, right. So how effective is that as an instrument to like use the Interpol to attack Russian exiles abroad? I mean, if I was in the diaspora and over there and home, you think here or Georgia or Armenia or wherever, you think you're London, you think you're a little safe aside from the poisonings, but can they use? Is he going to be able to use these legal international methods more frequently to punish those who speak out against him when they're not in Russia?
So I think it'll be more as a matter of Russian law and pressure that is put on particular countries. And we're seeing this, like in the example of the rock group, it was a B2. They wanted to try to deport them back to Russia, and they ended up going to Israel instead. So the Kremlin, through diplomatic means, is trying to pressure individual countries like Thailand and Indonesia and others, Dubai, not to allow prominent anti-war, anti-Putin performers to appear, whether they're comedians or singers. And which I think is very interesting. I mean, Putin is trying to kind of extend his repressive net in that way, which I think indicates that he feels threatened by it. It's not something I talked about a great deal in the book, because partly because I feel like it's been gelling. It's taken a while, but there's really a kind of a cultural resistance now to Putin and to what he's doing with the war. I mean, very, popular anti-war groups. There's this anthem by this singer known as Little Coin, Monetchka, which all the exiles have heard. She appears in places like Tbilisi. And I think that can be effective. Sometimes, the joke or the song resonates more than, a political slogan or placard. And so the battle continues. I think of it as a sort of a Russian civil war that's actually developed in these kinds of cases. I mean, you cannot underestimate the degree of hatred on both sides for the other.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned to me it's got to be a long game though, because with the killing of Navalny and then the way the war in Ukraine is going, Europe is helping them, America is iffy. You know, if the war just continues and continues, it, even though there's more resistance, Putin, he seems to have all the cards. And do you think that these rebels can ever oust Putin?
Well, I think it'll be, unless they manage to blow up his train, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to ferment a popular rebellion. I mean, I did think it was interesting, although I wouldn't include the Wagner group of mercenaries and their, deceased leader Prigozhin as part of this group. Nevertheless, they began this rebellion in the south of Russia, in Rostov-na-Donu. And from all reports, the people were not like opposed to them. I mean, maybe they were a little bit scared, but it seemed like there were very friendly relations between these mutineers and the local communities. So I don't know exactly, what those attitudes might be, but I agree with you that it is a long game. I think fitting into the generational aspect of it, what you hear from the exiles is, well, we're going to outlive Putin. I mean, he's 71 years old. There's this slogan, Putin paka živ, while Putin lives. We're not going to go back to Russia while Putin lives, but he's not going to be around forever. If you talk to the Navalny people, his chief of staff, for example, Leonid Volkov, I heard him talk a little bit on the sidelines of a conference in New York a couple of years ago, and he was talking about, well, when Stalin died, there was this vicious scrum, and nobody really knew who was going to come out on top. So I think the more far-seeing, seeing ones are kind of trying to prepare for what they would view as the day after. Putin has no obvious successor. That's the other thing. I mean, who would that be? I mean, he's shown no inclination to give up power. And even when he nominally gave it up to Dmitry Medvedev some years ago, I think it was clear to everyone that Putin was still the man, and that remains the case. But, 71 years old, we'll see. Life expectancy for Russian males is not the highest in the world.
Yeah. Well, let's open it up for questions now. And Beth and Alan, please come back on. Those of you listening, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And I just have one question for you, Alan, to kick it off. I found it very interesting in your book that these journalists, while they were complaining about how they couldn't get to where the story was, they were living in the metropole, as you point out, with a lot of Stalin cronies. If they knew Russian, they could have talked to them in the elevator. Now, obviously, the people might not have spoken to them, but it's just interesting in the different periods of how people, decided to do reporting. They're all there. They want to cover the war. They could have had all these scoops talking to, people who were in Stalin's cohort.
Well, it was a strange feature of the Metropole that there were these invisible walls between, they didn't live separately, but they sort of existed separately. All the foreigners would be, all the foreign journalists, they would drink somewhere different every night, and from time to time they would be walking down the corridor. If you remember, the corridors are extremely wide, and they're wide enough for two people to play chess, and they might pass a couple of people, one quite corpulent, playing chess, and they wouldn't notice them. They wouldn't talk to them. None of them spoke good Russian apart from Alexander Vert, but he was born in Petersburg, but a Brit. Anyway, but of course the corpulent man playing chess was none other than the man who had signed several thousand death certificates in the purges. He had a grace and favor apartment in the Metropole, and he stayed there until after the war. And not a single journalist knew that if they wanted to find out what had happened in the purges, this was the man to ask. But he was very unnoticeable. He had a very garrulous wife who used to talk not to the journalists, but to other people, talk about this and that, and she would tell everyone that she'd been Lenin's secretary, and she did all the talking, and he just played chess, and he had a butterfly collection which he looked after, but in the daytime he was signing death certificates, basically. So extraordinary that they were like sort of oil and water in the Metropole.
Yeah. So we have a question from James Brooke, who is asking you, Alan, in the movie Mr. Jones, how accurate was the portrayal of the Hotel Metropole?
I did see that. I saw a busy scene in front of the cashiers, and I remember some fairly insalubrious parties given by Walter Duranty. I seem to recall. Duranty didn't before 1941. Permanent correspondents such as Walter Duranty didn't live in the metropole. It was only when in wartime when they really needed to keep an eye on them. Of course, anyone who wants to see a new representation of the metropole will be able to see on March 29th the TV series based on a gentleman in Moscow, Immortals' multi-million book, million-selling novel will be available for streaming. If there are any Brits listening, the outdoor shots were taken in the north of England, in Bolton, which has a very grand town hall dating from Victorian times. Anyway, so that'll be another opportunity to see the metropole represented, though it's more a magical metropole than the real one, of course. Magical metropole, a magical realist metropole.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing it anyway. Good.
Paul, one thing we didn't discuss about your book is the warriors, and I didn't realize until I read your book that that there were some exiled Russians who created a system to attack Russian drones in Ukraine and take out a lot of them. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I read into this guy who's kind of a brilliant Russian physicist who grew up in Siberia, Mikhail, and kind of a Siberian nationalist. I mean, his whole belief is that, Russia is too big, it should be broken up, and Siberia should rule itself in a kind of liberal Western style way. Anyway, he became an early opponent of Putin's regime, as he would call it, and got into all kinds of opposition activities and went into exile and was living in Switzerland when the invasion happened, and linked up with a friend of his who was a Ukrainian physicist. And together they devised this system made up of noise sensors, basically microphones, the system was manufactured in Kiev, and it was strung along, cell towers and things like that to identify by noise incoming Russian missiles and drones, and saving civilian lives. Undoubtedly, I was in Ukraine this past September, and we had quite a light show at about 4 o'clock in the morning from the balcony of my hotel in Kiev, and I thought of them. I mean, I'm sure there are now more established systems available, but this was early in the war, and it really contributed. And one thing that the Ukrainian physicist told me of his friend, he said Mikhail was in some ways a better friend to Ukraine than some Ukrainians, because it's not often talked about. There were quite a number of military age Ukrainians, fled the country and are still outside of Ukraine. It's kind of a problem. So my guy, Mikhail, was one of these warriors. And, it's an interesting ethical issue as well, because he was clear that thought he was saving Ukrainian lives and not killing Russian soldiers. But there are other Russian exiles who are quite happy to kill the Russian soldiers. I mean, they will pay and finance for Ukraine, like tank killing equipment and stuff like that. I mean, the battle is joined.
Oh, thank you, Paul. We have a question from Yvonne Murray in Australia. She says, could the panelists please comment on the modern day Western apologists for Russia's regime? Do they have any influence inside Russia? And also, are they similar to the apologists of previous eras?
Wow. I don't know. Alan, do you have any? I could answer. Alan, do you have any thoughts?
If you're talking about the 1930s, um, the apologists, or what Lenin called the useful idiots, some of them had strong beliefs in socialism. The capitalism had really fallen on its knees from 1929. So it was, there was a reason to be looking for a different way of organizing things. So you can understand that people might want to go to Russia and be told that it was the future hope of humanity. But when I see Tucker Carlson, I don't see what the ideological basis of it. I mean, obviously, there's a great desire. I'm not in America. A great desire to be different, to be loved, to be someone important. But I don't see any ideological any justification for that. And when I saw his long so-called interview with Putin, and Putin just sort of embarrassed him, really, didn't he? He gave him a half-hour-long history lesson. So Tucker Carlson looked ridiculous, and Putin looked like a sort of gibbering old geezer. Anyway, what do you think?
I would draw one distinction. I think that the Western apologists of the earlier time, at least in the Soviet time, were a number of them genuinely, however misguidingly, enamored of the Soviet, classless society as they saw it in comparison to the decadent, capitalist society of places including England and Cambridge and so forth. Whereas today, I think there is a somewhat ideological dynamic, although it certainly didn't come out in Tucker Carlson's interview, but some conservatives in America see a kind of anti-woke, as they might describe it, kind of system at work in Russia and also in Hungary. And Putin, for example, has been notably hostile to, gay people. I mean, just anything that's associated with sort of the progressive Western values as we now define them, same-sex marriage and so forth. Russia is still very patriarchal place with, I think, an influence of the Orthodox Christian heritage. And I think that probably appeals to people like Tucker Carlson. I mean, he also, I think, has slobbered over Orban in Hungary on sort of the same principles. So they think that they're somehow maybe trolling the libs or something in America by bowing to Putin in this kind of weird, somewhat conservative values agenda. There's some strange stuff going on. There was this so-called naked party in Moscow that got a lot of attention and it's not the only one. And people are talking about, yeah, I mean, it's Moscow, for goodness sake. I mean, stuff like that probably happens in New York, every night of the week. But it got back to Putin, and somehow he went nuts, and everyone has had to sort of slavishly apologize for their, participation in the naked party. So I think there's a kind of a strange dynamic going on there.
Beth, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I was just laughing. It's not my part of New York where there are the naked parties, but I hear what you.
I didn't go to any naked parties when I lived in Moscow.
I've been in Moscow,
but I wouldn't have surprised me if they were happening.
Well, and another part of the calculus that's different is that one of the people who are has the most to say about Russia is former president and perhaps maybe again President Trump, and that's certainly a giant influence in everything when it comes to Russia. So we're all gonna have to wait and see what happens and see. Could be I'll keep my own politics out of it, but certainly that's the elephant in the room. Should we go to the next question?
Yes. With the new propaganda rising up due to technologies like AI and deep fakes, what will the fight for a better Russia look like in the next few months?
Well, if that's for me, I would say that, I mean, there is enormous creativity among the exiles in terms of their ability to use technology. And I haven't heard too much about the AI dimension of it, but they're pretty ingenious, I think, in getting their messages across. And so I just expect that to intensify. I don't think anyone has anything on the Russians when it comes to using these tools. We're very familiar with Russian disinformation techniques and so forth, and that the state is advancing. But I think that those tools are equally available to the Russians who are now outside of Russia seeking to influence things. So I just think this information war will just intensify and take place on a number of these planes.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, Paul, a lot of the Russians who left in the last couple of years are the tech people who are very adept at all of these things.
A lot of them.
Yeah. So James Brooks asks, Paul, what are the prospects for various exile secessionist groups, regional and ethnic?
Does he mean, okay, I guess we're not gonna be able to ask what he means, like those who want to break up Russia in some sense? How do you interpret that question? I guess I'm not quite sure I understand it.
But to break away from Russia, he's saying.
Oh. So, which ones does he have in mind? Like I mean, I see, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. I think Putin is trying to gather Russian peoples into this greater Russia, which Ukraine is certainly part of that. Just the other day, these secessionists in Moldova, they occupy this kind of separatist, enclave, asked for quote unquote protection from Russia, which sounded to me like, maybe the Kremlin has written their, protection plea. And similarly, there is a very large Russian ethnic minority in eastern Latvia on the border with Russia. And the Latvians, I have to say, they're kind of cracking down on the use of the Russian language and so forth, which sort of feeds into Putin's agenda because his whole thing is about protecting, the Russian peoples, the people who speak the Russian language. And so that just sort of feeds into him. So I think the prospect is for more Putin meddling in these various conflicts. And we also, we already have Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I mean, there are all these like little or not so little places that are kind of affiliated in some way with Russia that nobody else recognizes. Who recognizes Abkhazia? I think maybe like North Korea, maybe. I was there once. I almost got trapped there, actually. It's not a great place.
Go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
Put my oar in. I just heard something about sort of separatist sentiment in Yakutia, which they call the Sakha. But the trouble is, it's quite difficult if you're in the middle of Siberia to secede. You don't have a navigable ocean to connection to the outside world. If you're a Buryat, you've got Russia on 3 sides and China on the 4th side. China is not going to welcome any split, they would see. So it's quite difficult to imagine it. And if it were going to happen, it would be more on the Yugoslav level because there are in every one of these autonomous republics, there are large minorities, if not majorities of Russian or Slavs, Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. So it's not going to be easy for these to split.
No.
There is nationalist feeling growing inside the Russian Federation. Not really a federation, actually. It's not really a state. It's still a sort of empire, still a sort of land empire. But it's quite hard unless you have a sort of some seaboard to think about seceding. The Chechens course, didn't manage it.
Yeah.
I was going to say, given what he did, given Chechnya and now Ukraine, I can't see Putin giving more sovereignty to some of the smaller groups inside. And Alan, in reading your book, I just found it so sad to think about parts of Ukraine. Like you look back and you say, in the Civil War, after the Bolsheviks took over, Ukraine people died by the millions. Then they died in the famine. Then in Hitler's invasion, a lot of the same towns. I mean, it was so striking. Names I would have never known except for the last couple years. The towns where we've seen fighting the past couple years had fighting during World War II. And then, 2014 Crimea, and now, I mean, I'm glad I don't live there.
Yeah. Ukraine is a sort of often neglected, but you could write a lot of the 20th century history based on what happened to Ukraine, and and I think Stalin did actually accept that because Russia didn't have any far-flung parts of its empire beyond the seas, it had to treat Ukraine basically like a colony and beggar it for all it's worth to extract all the agriculture and other resources. So yes, a lot of history can be rewritten if you put Ukraine at the center of it.
Mm.
Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So, Paul, do you have any last comments? We're getting close to the time that we need to sign off.
Right. Well, one tiny addition about as I think about it, the succession. I mean, one thing people need to understand is that the exiles are not just the people like the liberal type people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, I met plenty of people who come from Siberia, for example, and I think a pervasive theme is guilt. It's an age-old Russian theme. I have a chapter in my book about guilt, and I was just struck in meeting, one person after another, that it was almost like I was, they wanted to confess to me. I mean, I sat down with a writer in Tbilisi for a drink one evening, and the first thing she asked me is, "Are we guilty?" And I mean, I guess if you ask that question, you're saying in a way, yeah, we are. And there's this sense that they were responsible in some way for what happened in the Russian family, with Putin not doing enough to oppose him. And so there's a lot that can be done with guilt and shame and so forth. And maybe in some ways that can engender something good. But I am afraid that we're in a fairly dark period right now. And as you said, Patty, it's a long game.
Alan, do you have any last comments?
I think I've shot my bolt. I don't see. I was quite struck by one thing I read after Navalny's death, and that was a piece written by by Mikhail Shishkin, and he was accompanying Navalny a few years ago in the provinces, and a man came up to Navalny and said, "Oh, I really like you, and I like what you say." And Navalny said, "Will you vote for me?" And the man looked a bit unsettled, and he said, "Well, I really like you, but when you're president, I'll vote for you. I'll vote for you when you're president." And this anecdote seems to encapsulate one aspect of not of the liberal cities, but of the deep provinces, that people don't really feel that it's up to them to choose the leader. They're happy to vote to acclaim someone presented to them, but the idea that they have the right to choose the leader still seems to be a bit distant to them. So I'm afraid I don't see enormous changes happening very soon.
Well, I think with that, unless Beth, you have something else you want to add, we
No,
can-
I just wanted to thank Alan for joining us so late, British time. Staying
Ah,
up
well,
so late.
it's a cold and rainy night, so I found one of those naked parties.
Yeah,
More at the
here's
weekend.
I only have an an electronic copy of your
I
book,
can
Paul,
see
but
you
here's
there.
here's the Red Hotel. It's really a marvelous book. They're both marvelous books.
Yes,
And Patty,
and they're in
you-
the chat. You can buy the books on the links in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me, Patty, and glad to see you again, Beth, and pleased to meet you, Alan.
Right. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
it's great to talk to you, and even by Zoom, which has worked perfectly, hasn't it? No complaints.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And maybe Patty, you can just speak about the next event that we're having for maybe of interest to people who enjoyed this panel.
Yes, on March 13th, we're having a book called News Hawks in Berlin, which is kind of the Western correspondents trying to cover Hitler, equivalent to Alan's book of them trying to cover Stalin. And it's by two AP people, one a longtime journalist, one a researcher, and Ann Cooper helped finish it up. Larry Heinzerling is her husband, who died a few years ago, and Randy Hershaft is the researcher, and then Anne helped finish the book after Larry died. And it's a very open book about the conflicts that AP had covering Hitler, particularly with their German photography joint venture or subsidiary. So it's another story about how covering fascist governments is very difficult. So, all right, thank you, everybody. It was a wonderful program.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.